Clara Whitfield's hands shook as she gripped the cold stone railing of the terrace, her sister's laughter still ringing in her ears. Behind her, through the tall glass doors, the family gathering continued as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just been humiliated in front of everyone she loved. "A duke," her sister Margaret had said, tears of laughter streaming down her face. "Clara thinks a duke is going to fall in love with her. Someone pinch me." The others had joined in, their voices overlapping in cruel amusement. Her cousin Peter had nearly choked on his drink. Her aunt had shaken her head with pity, the kind of pity that stings worse than mockery. Clara had said the words without thinking, caught up in the warmth of the evening, and now she wished she could take them back and swallow them whole. She had not meant to say it out loud. The feeling had lived quietly inside her for 3 years, tucked away like a secret letter never sent. She worked as an event planner for Ashworth Hall, coordinating charity galas and formal dinners for one of the wealthiest families in the county. Duke Alexander Ashworth was her employer, technically. In practice, he was something else entirely, something she had never dared name until tonight. Clara pressed her palm against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. The night air was sharp and cold, and she welcomed it. Anything to distract from the burning shame crawling up her neck. She had first met Alexander 2 years ago, during the planning of a charity gala for children's hospitals. She remembered the way he had knelt down to speak with a young boy in a wheelchair, patient and gentle, completely unaware that anyone was watching. He had not performed kindness for an audience. He simply was kind, quietly and without need for praise. That single moment had undone her. She had watched him for months after that, cataloging small things. The way he remembered the names of every member of his household staff. The way he never raised his voice, even when frustrated. The way his eyes softened slightly whenever she entered a room to review event details with him. She told herself it was nothing. He was polite to everyone. That was simply his nature. But tonight, after 2 glasses of wine and the gentle prodding of her cousin who wanted to know if she was seeing anyone, the truth had slipped out before she could stop it, and now the whole family knew, and the whole family thought it was the funniest thing they had heard in years. "Clara?" She turned sharply. Her sister stood in the doorway, still smiling, though the laughter had faded from her voice. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, though she did not sound sorry at all. "It's just funny. You know that, right? A duke, and a girl who plans his parties. It's like something from an old film." "I know," Clara said quietly. "It was a joke. Forget I said anything." Margaret studied her for a moment, something shifting behind her eyes, as though she suspected the truth ran deeper than Clara wanted to admit. But she said nothing further, only shrugged and returned inside, leaving Clara alone with the night sky and her own foolish heart. What Clara did not know, what she could never have known, was that 30 feet away, standing near the open window of the drawing room, Duke Alexander Ashworth had heard every word. He had come to the gathering as a favor, invited by Clara's employer to discuss details for an upcoming fundraiser, and had arrived early, before anyone expected him. He had been standing near the window, phone in hand, when the laughter first began. He had not meant to listen, but something about hearing his own name stopped him where he stood, and by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late to walk away without being noticed. He had heard the mockery. He had heard Clara's soft, humiliated silence following it, and he had felt something twist inside his chest that surprised him with its intensity. Alexander was a man well accustomed to being talked about. People speculated about his wealth, his properties, his bloodline, his prospects for marriage. He had grown a thick skin over the years, learning to let gossip pass through him like wind through an open window. But this was different. This was not gossip about him. This was cruelty aimed at someone else. Someone who had done nothing wrong except feel something honest. He thought of Clara now, the way he had noticed her long before tonight. She was thorough in her work, arriving earlier than anyone expected and staying later than necessary, always attentive to details others overlooked. She remembered that his late mother's favorite flowers were peonies, and had quietly included them in every event without being asked. She never fawned over him the way some people did, never tried too hard to impress him. She simply did her work with quiet dedication, and somewhere in the last 2 years, Alexander had found himself looking forward to their meetings more than he cared to admit. He had told himself it was simple respect for competent work. He was beginning to suspect it was something more. Now, standing in the shadow of the drawing room, listening to her family reduce her feelings to a punchline, he felt an unfamiliar anger rise in his chest. Not anger at Clara, anger on her behalf. He remained still, careful not to reveal himself, and slipped quietly out through a side door before anyone noticed his presence. He needed time to think before he decided what, if anything, he intended to do. Outside on the terrace, Clara finally composed herself enough to return inside. She smoothed the front of her dress, forced a neutral expression onto her face, and walked back through the glass doors as though the last 10 minutes had never happened. The evening continued around her in a blur of small talk and forced smiles. She nodded at the right moments, laughed when expected, and counted the minutes until she could excuse herself and go home. When she finally did leave, nearly an hour later, she drove home in silence, her mind replaying the humiliation over and over, like a wound she could not stop touching. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, wondering why she had ever allowed herself to feel something so far beyond her reach. A duke did not fall in love with an event planner. That only happened in stories, the kind her grandmother used to read to her as a child, stories with tidy endings that had nothing to do with real life. The next morning, Clara arrived at her office early, as she always did, determined to bury the previous night beneath a mountain of work. She had 3 events to plan that month, including a formal dinner at Ashworth Hall in 2 weeks, and she intended to focus entirely on logistics, seating charts, and catering menus, anything to keep her mind from wandering. Her manager, a brisk woman named Eleanor, called her into the office just after 9. "The Duke's assistant called this morning," Eleanor said, flipping through a folder without looking up. "He's requesting you specifically for the dinner, not the team, you." Clara's stomach dropped. "Me specifically?" That's what the message said. Apparently he wants direct communication with the lead planner this time, and he's asked that it be you. Eleanor finally looked up, one eyebrow raised. "Did something happen between you two that I should know about?" "No," Clara said quickly. Too quickly. "Nothing happened. I don't know why he would ask for me." Eleanor shrugged, clearly uninterested in pursuing the matter further, and slid the folder across the desk. "Well, congratulations, I suppose. You'll be working closely with him for the next 2 weeks. Don't disappoint him." Clara took the folder with trembling hands, her mind spinning. She thought immediately of the previous night, of the humiliation on the terrace, and a horrible thought crept into her mind. Had someone told him? Had word of her confession somehow reached him, and was this his way of either testing her or, worse, mocking her in return? She pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. Alexander Ashworth was not cruel. Whatever his reasons, she doubted humiliation was among them. But that only left more troubling questions. Why had he asked for her, specifically, the very morning after she had confessed feelings for him to a room full of people who thought the idea was laughable? She spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet anxiety, reviewing details for the dinner while trying to convince herself that this was simply routine, that dukes requested specific planners for events all the time, that there was nothing unusual happening at all. But deep down, in the part of her heart she had tried so hard to silence the night before, a small and dangerous hope began to stir. That evening, as she left the office, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding before she had even read a word. The message was brief. It was from Alexander himself, not his assistant. He wrote that he looked forward to working with her on the dinner, and hoped she would be available for a planning meeting at the estate the following afternoon. Clara read the message 3 times, searching for hidden meaning in every word, finding none, and yet unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, between the world she had known and whatever was coming next. She did not know, could not have known, that Alexander had spent that entire day fighting his own uncertainty, wondering if reaching out to her directly was wise or foolish, wondering if he was about to complicate both their lives beyond repair. But he had made his decision the moment he walked away from that terrace the night before. Whatever came next, he intended to see it through. Back at the estate that same evening, Alexander sat alone in his study, the fire crackling low in the hearth, a glass of untouched water sitting on the desk beside him. He had canceled his evening plans, telling his assistant he needed time to think, though he had not explained what about. His mind kept returning to the sound of Clara's silence on that terrace, the way she had not defended herself, had not argued back against her family's laughter, had simply absorbed it and asked them to forget she had spoken at all. He understood something about that kind of silence. He had grown up in a world that watched his every move, judged his every choice, and he had learned early that defending himself against mockery only invited more of it. Silence had become his own armor, a way of surviving scrutiny without giving it more fuel. Seeing that same instinct in Clara, someone he had always thought of as steady and composed, had struck something tender in him he had not expected. He thought about the years he had known her, the small kindnesses she offered without expecting recognition, the quiet competence that had made her indispensable to every event she touched. He had never allowed himself to examine his own feelings toward her too closely, aware of the complications such feelings would bring. A duke did not simply pursue an employee without consequence. There would be whispers, assumptions, judgments from every direction, aimed at her far more cruelly than at him. And yet here he was, already having sent the message, already having set something in motion that he could not easily undo. He told himself this was simply an act of decency, a way of showing her through action that her feelings were not something to be ashamed of, even if he could not yet promise her anything more. But some quieter, more honest part of him knew the truth ran deeper than decency alone. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the dark grounds of the estate, the gardens his mother had once tended, now maintained by careful staff in her memory. He thought of peonies blooming in spring, of Clara's quiet attention to a detail no one had asked her to remember, and he felt, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, something close to hope. Tomorrow, he would see her again. Whatever came of it, he intended to face it honestly, without pretense, without the careful distance he usually kept between himself and the world. Clara Whitfield deserved that much, at the very least. Clara arrived at Ashworth Hall the next afternoon dressed in her most professional attire, a navy blazer over a simple blouse, her notes organized in a leather folder she had carried to 100 meetings before. She told herself this was routine, nothing more than another planning session, and yet her hands trembled slightly as she stepped out of her car and approached the grand entrance. A member of the household staff greeted her at the door and led her through the familiar hallways toward the east study, a smaller and more private room than the formal reception spaces she usually worked in. Clara noted the change immediately. Previous meetings had always taken place in the main conference room, alongside members of his administrative team. Today, it seemed, would be different. Alexander stood when she entered, a gesture of respect she had not expected. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, his expression calm and unreadable, though something in his eyes seemed warmer than the formal courtesy he usually extended. "Thank you for coming, Clara," he said. "I know this is unusual, requesting you directly rather than going through your team." "It's no trouble at all," she replied, settling into the chair, grateful for the folder in her hands, something solid to hold on to. "I'm happy to help however you need." They began discussing details for the upcoming dinner, a formal gathering intended to celebrate a partnership between the Ashworth estate and a regional hospital foundation. Clara walked him through seating arrangements, menu selections, and the schedule for the evening, her voice growing steadier as she settled into familiar territory. Work, at least, she understood. But as the meeting progressed, she noticed small things that unsettled her composure. The way Alexander listened to her suggestions with genuine attention, rather than the polite half-interest she usually received from busy clients. The way he asked follow-up questions that showed he had actually considered her previous answers rather than simply nodding along. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long whenever she looked up from her notes. "You've thought of everything," he said, after she finished outlining the final details. "As always." "It's my job," she said, a little too quickly, unsure why the compliment made her chest tighten with something between pleasure and panic. "It's more than that," he said quietly. "You care about these events succeeding in a way that goes beyond professional obligation. I've noticed that for some time." Clara did not know how to respond. She glanced down at her notes, searching for something safe to say, something that would return the conversation to comfortable, professional ground. "I want every event to reflect well on the family. That's simply good business." Alexander studied her for a long moment, and Clara felt certain he saw straight through her deflection. But he did not press further, allowing the conversation to return to logistics, and Clara breathed a quiet sigh of relief as the tension eased. Over the following days, Clara found herself at the estate more frequently than any previous project had required. Alexander insisted on being involved in details he had never concerned himself with before, from flower arrangements to the specific wording of place cards. Clara told herself this was simply his way of ensuring the event's success, given the importance of the hospital partnership. She did not allow herself to consider other explanations, but others around them noticed differently. "He's never been this involved in an event before," remarked Henry, the head of estate operations, during a break in one of their planning sessions. He said it casually, almost as a joke, but Clara caught the curious glance he sent in Alexander's direction as the Duke stepped out to take a call. "He wants this partnership to succeed," Clara said, more defensively than she intended. "It's an important cause." "Of course," Henry said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. Word began to spread through the household staff, quiet whispers exchanged in kitchens and hallways, speculation about why the Duke had suddenly taken such personal interest in event planning. and why that interest seemed to center specifically around Clara. She caught fragments of conversation she was not meant to hear, comments about her sudden rise in importance, questions about what she might have done to earn such attention. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her work, but the whispers followed her regardless, growing louder with each passing day. One afternoon, nearly a week into the preparations, Clara arrived early for a meeting and found herself alone in the garden while she waited for Alexander to finish a previous appointment. She walked slowly along the stone paths, admiring the careful arrangement of flowers, when she came across a small section dedicated entirely to peonies, blooming despite the early season in a carefully maintained greenhouse extension. "My mother's favorite," Alexander's voice said from behind her, startling her slightly. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite place. "You remembered that detail from 2 years ago and included them at every event since. I've always wondered if you realized how much that meant to me." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "I noticed everything," he said simply. The words hung between them, heavier than their surface meaning suggested. Clara searched his face for clarification, uncertain how to interpret such a direct admission, but before either of them could say more, a member of the household staff appeared to announce that the meeting room was ready. The moment passed, but Clara carried it with her for the rest of the day, replaying his words over and over, trying to decide whether she had imagined the warmth in his voice or whether something real had passed between them in that quiet garden. Their working relationship continued to deepen over the following days, professional courtesy slowly giving way to something more familiar, more comfortable. Alexander began sharing small details about himself that Clara suspected he rarely offered to others. Memories of his mother, frustrations with certain family obligations, quiet observations about the pressures of his position that few people ever saw beneath his composed public exterior. In turn, Clara found herself opening up as well, sharing stories about her own family, her love of organizing events precisely because chaos made her anxious, her quiet dream of one day starting her own event planning company rather than working for someone else's firm. "You should," Alexander said, when she mentioned the idea almost as an afterthought during a late afternoon meeting. "You have the talent for it, and the dedication." "It's complicated," she said. "Starting a business requires capital I don't have, connections I haven't built yet. It's easier to dream about than actually pursue. Sometimes the things worth pursuing require exactly that kind of difficulty," he said. "It doesn't mean they're impossible." She looked up at him, surprised by the quiet encouragement in his voice, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the air between them charged with something neither seemed willing to name. It was Clara who broke the silence first, gathering her notes with hands that were not quite steady. "We should finish reviewing the final details before the dinner. There's still the matter of the arrival schedule to confirm." Alexander nodded, allowing the moment to pass, though Clara caught the small, knowing smile that crossed his face before he returned his attention to the paperwork before them. The night of the dinner arrived 2 weeks after their first private meeting. Clara oversaw every detail with practiced precision, ensuring the flowers were perfectly arranged. The seating chart accounted for every guest's preferences. The catering staff understood the timing of each course. The event unfolded beautifully, guests mingling comfortably, conversation flowing easily between representatives of the Hospital Foundation and members of the Ashworth family and their associates. Throughout the evening, Clara noticed Alexander watching her from across the room whenever she checked on various details, his gaze finding hers repeatedly, even as he engaged in conversation with important guests. Each time their eyes met, something warm passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Near the end of the evening, as guests began departing, and staff began the quiet work of clearing the dining hall, Alexander found a moment to approach her privately near the entrance hall. "The evening was a success," he said. "Thanks entirely to your work." "I'm glad it went well," Clara said, suddenly aware of how close he stood, how quiet the hallway had become as the last guests said their farewells in the distance. "Clara," he said, his voice lower than before, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can answer honestly, without concern for your position here." Her heart began to pound. "What is it?" Before he could answer, a sharp voice cut through the quiet hallway, and both of them turned to find Margaret Holloway, a distant relation of the Ashworth family who had attended the dinner as a guest, standing several feet away with an expression of cold amusement. "Am I interrupting something?" Margaret asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp with calculation. "Or is this simply the event planner receiving special instructions after hours?" The warmth of the moment shattered instantly. Clara stepped back, professional distance reasserting itself even as her cheeks burned with sudden self-consciousness. Alexander's expression hardened, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "Miss Whitfield and I were discussing details of the evening," he said, "nothing more." Margaret's smile widened, unconvinced, and something in that smile sent a cold thread of unease through Clara's chest. She had the distinct impression that whatever moment had just passed between herself and Alexander, someone else had noticed it too, and would not let it remain private for long. "How thoughtful of you both," Margaret continued, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of a passing staff member. "Discussing details. Of course, I imagine there's a great deal to discuss, given how often Miss Whitfield seems to be here these days." "Margaret," Alexander said, a warning edge entering his tone. "I don't believe this concerns you." "No, I suppose it doesn't," she said lightly, though her eyes moved deliberately between the two of them, cataloging every detail of their proximity, the flush still visible on Clara's cheeks. "Though I do wonder what the rest of the family will think, once they hear how personally involved you've become in something as ordinary as event planning." She offered a final, thin smile, before turning and walking toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor with unhurried precision, as though she had all the time in the world to let her words settle and take root. Clara watched her go, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had heard enough about Margaret from other staff members to understand the woman's reputation. She was known throughout the extended family circle for her sharp tongue and her habit of turning private matters into public spectacle whenever it suited her interests. Whatever Margaret had witnessed tonight, Clara doubted it would remain contained for long. "Don't let her words trouble you," Alexander said, once Margaret had disappeared from view. "She enjoys stirring trouble where none exists." "But there was something," Clara said quietly, unable to stop herself. "Wasn't there?" Before she interrupted, Alexander was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful, weighing something in his mind before he spoke. "There was," he admitted. "And there still is, if you're willing to hear it. But perhaps not tonight, not with half the household still finishing their duties and Margaret likely gossiping to anyone who will listen before she's even reached her car." Clara nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution, though disappointment settled heavily in her chest regardless. "Another time then. Soon," he promised. "I give you my word." She returned home that night with her mind spinning, replaying every detail of the evening, from the warmth of his gaze across the dining hall, to the interrupted question that had hung so tantalizingly close to being asked. She barely slept, caught between hope and fear, uncertain what to make of a man who occupied a world so entirely different from her own, showing her such deliberate, unmistakable attention. The following morning, she arrived at the office to find her manager waiting with an unusually serious expression. "There's talk," Eleanor said without preamble, closing her office door behind Clara, "about you and the Duke. I need to know if there's anything I should be concerned about, professionally speaking." "There's nothing inappropriate happening," Clara said, though the defensive edge in her voice surprised even herself. "We've been working closely on the Hospital Foundation event, that's all." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to press the matter further. "Just be careful, Clara. People in his circle can be unkind to those they perceive as overstepping their place. I don't want to see you hurt by something that isn't worth the risk." The warning stayed with Clara throughout the day, a quiet undercurrent of worry beneath her usual focus. She thought of Margaret's cold smile, of the whispers she had already caught among the household staff, of her own family's mocking laughter just weeks before. Everyone, it seemed, was prepared to judge her for feelings she had never intended to reveal, for attention she had never sought but could no longer deny receiving. That afternoon, a message arrived from Alexander, brief but deliberate. He asked if she would be willing to meet him privately that evening, away from the estate, somewhere quiet where they could speak without interruption or the risk of prying eyes. Clara stared at the message for a long time before responding, torn between caution and the undeniable pull of curiosity that had been building for weeks. She agreed to meet him at a small tea house on the edge of town, a modest establishment far removed from the grandeur of Ashworth Hall, chosen specifically, she suspected, for its privacy and distance from anyone who might recognize either of them. When she arrived that evening, Alexander was already waiting, seated at a corner table away from the windows, dressed casually in a way she had rarely seen him, as though he too wanted to shed some of the formality that usually surrounded him. "Thank you for coming," he said, rising briefly as she took her seat across from him. "You said there was something you wanted to tell me," Clara said, unable to keep the nervous anticipation from her voice. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the table before him, his expression carrying none of the practiced composure she usually associated with him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unusually uncertain. "I heard what your family said about you that night at the gathering," he admitted. "I wasn't meant to overhear it, but I did, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "You heard that?" "Every word," he said gently. "And I want you to know, Clara, that what they mocked was never foolish to me. Not for a moment." The tea house around them seemed to fade into silence as Clara absorbed his words, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Whatever she had expected from this meeting, it had not been this, a direct and unguarded admission that stripped away every careful distance they had maintained between them for years. "Alexander," she began, uncertain what words could possibly follow such a revelation. But before she could find them, his phone buzzed sharply on the table between them, the screen lighting up with an urgent message from his assistant. His expression shifted immediately, concern replacing the vulnerability of moments before. "I'm sorry," he said, already rising from his seat. "There's a matter at the estate that requires my immediate attention. I don't want to leave, not now, but I must." Clara nodded, disappointment and worry mingling in equal measure as she watched him hurry toward the exit, leaving her alone with unanswered questions and the growing certainty that whatever was unfolding between them had only just begun. The urgent matter that pulled Alexander away from the tea house turned out to be a minor issue with a supplier contract, resolved within the hour, but by the time he returned to his car, Clara had already gone home, her message simply stating that she understood and hoped everything was well. He read it twice, wishing he had insisted she wait, wishing he had found the courage to finish what he started before circumstances interrupted them. Over the following days, their private meetings continued in careful secrecy, brief conversations stolen between official planning sessions, quiet moments in the garden where they spoke more like two people who had known each other for years than employer and employee. Alexander found himself looking forward to these stolen minutes more than any other part of his day, and he suspected, from the way Clara's expression softened whenever he appeared, that she felt something similar. But secrecy, no matter how carefully maintained, rarely survives long in a household filled with watchful eyes. Margaret Holloway had not forgotten what she witnessed at the dinner. Over the following 2 weeks, she made it her personal mission to gather information, speaking quietly with household staff, attending family functions where she steered conversation toward Alexander's recent habits, and piecing together a narrative that painted Clara as a calculating opportunist rather than a woman caught in genuine, unexpected affection. The first formal dinner following the Hospital Foundation event was a smaller gathering, intended to celebrate the extended family's quarterly reunion, held at Ashworth Hall with nearly 40 guests in attendance. Clara had been asked to oversee the arrangements once again, and though she had hoped to remain in the background as usual, Alexander insisted she join a portion of the evening as a guest rather than staff, a gesture that immediately drew unwanted attention. She arrived, dressed modestly but elegantly, aware of how out of place she felt among guests whose entire wardrobes likely cost more than her yearly salary. She kept close to the edges of the room, speaking with familiar staff members and avoiding prolonged conversation with the family's extended relations, until Margaret approached her directly, wine glass in hand, her smile sharp and deliberate. "Miss Whitfield," Margaret said, loud enough for several nearby guests to turn their heads. "How unusual to see you here as a guest, rather than in your usual capacity." "The Duke was kind enough to invite me," Clara said carefully, aware of the eyes now drawn toward their conversation. "How generous of him," Margaret said, her voice carrying an edge of mockery thinly veiled as pleasant conversation. "Tell me, is it customary for event planners to receive such personal invitations from their employers? I only ask because I've never known Alexander to extend such courtesy to anyone in your position before." Clara felt her cheeks flush, aware that several guests had paused their own conversations to listen. "I couldn't say what's customary. I'm simply grateful for the opportunity." "Of course you are," Margaret said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "It must be quite an opportunity indeed, working so closely with a man of his standing. I imagine some might even call it fortunate timing, given how quickly your involvement in his affairs has grown." The implication hung heavy in the air, and Clara felt the weight of every gaze now turned in her direction, some curious, some judgmental, a few openly amused at her expense. She searched for a response that would not escalate the confrontation, but before she could find one, Margaret continued, her voice growing bolder. "I only mention it because I've heard whispers, you understand, about certain ambitions some women develop when given access to wealth and position they were never born into. It would be a shame if anyone mistook genuine affection for something more calculated." The room seemed to hold its breath. Clara's throat tightened, humiliation burning hot beneath her composed exterior, and she felt 15 years old again, standing on that terrace listening to her family's laughter, except this time the audience was larger, and the stakes felt immeasurably higher. "That's quite enough, Margaret." Alexander's voice cut through the tension like a blade, sharp and unmistakably firm. He had crossed the room without Clara noticing, his expression carrying none of the practiced composure he usually maintained in public settings. Every guest in the immediate vicinity turned toward him, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "I was simply making conversation," Margaret said, though her confidence flickered slightly under his gaze. "You were making insinuations," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly enough that no one nearby could mistake his meaning. "About a woman whose only fault has been exceptional dedication to her work and, apparently, catching my attention. If you have concerns about my personal affairs, I would prefer you address them to me directly, rather than attempting to humiliate someone who has done nothing to deserve it." Margaret's face flushed, embarrassment replacing her earlier confidence as she realized the extent to which she had misjudged the moment. "I meant no offense, Alexander. I only worry for the family's reputation." "The family's reputation," Alexander said coldly, "is hardly threatened by decency and kindness. If anything threatens it, it would be cruelty disguised as concern." He turned to Clara then, his expression softening considerably as he addressed her directly, ignoring the dozens of eyes still watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "Clara, I apologize for this. You deserve far better treatment than what you've received tonight." Clara managed a small nod, though her voice failed her entirely, emotion rising too quickly for words to form. Alexander seemed to understand, offering her his arm and gently guiding her away from the immediate crowd, toward a quieter corner of the room where the worst of the attention could not follow. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, once they had found a measure of privacy near the tall windows overlooking the estate grounds. "I should have anticipated something like this happening. Margaret has never been kind to those she perceives as threats, and I fear my own actions have only made things worse for you." "It's not your fault," Clara said, though her voice trembled with the effort of holding back tears. "I knew what people would think. I knew this would happen eventually." "That doesn't make it right," he said firmly, "and it doesn't mean you should have to endure it silently." They stood together for a long moment, the noise of the dinner continuing in the background, though Clara felt distinctly separate from it now, as though she and Alexander occupied a small bubble of quiet amid the chaos of judgment surrounding them. "I should go," she said eventually, unable to bear the thought of returning to the crowd, of facing the curious and judgmental stares that surely awaited her. "Let me walk you out," Alexander offered. He escorted her through a side corridor, away from the main hall, and out toward the front entrance where her car waited. Neither spoke much during the walk, the weight of the evening settling heavily between them, until they reached the entrance and Alexander stopped her gently with a hand on her arm. "Clara," he said, his voice low and earnest, "what Margaret said tonight, and what your family said weeks ago, none of it reflects the truth of who you are, or what exists between us. I want you to know that clearly, without doubt." "What does exist between us?" Clara asked, finally allowing the question that had haunted her for weeks to surface openly. Alexander was quiet for a moment, searching for words adequate to the weight of the question. "Something I have not felt in a very long time," he said finally. "Something I did not expect to feel towards someone I first knew only as a colleague, and something I am no longer willing to deny, regardless of what others might say or think." Clara's breath caught, hope and fear warring within her chest in equal measure. "People will continue to judge us. Margaret is not the only one who will think this is inappropriate, or opportunistic, or foolish. Let them judge," Alexander said firmly. "I have spent my entire life allowing others' opinions to dictate caution in matters that mattered far less than this. I am tired of that caution, Clara. I would rather face judgment honestly than continue pretending indifference toward feelings that are entirely real." She looked up at him, searching his eyes for any hint of hesitation, finding none, only quiet and unwavering certainty. Whatever fear remained in her heart began to soften beneath the weight of his sincerity. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to understand what this means, for both of us, given everything that stands between our worlds." "Take whatever time you need," Alexander said gently. "I am not going anywhere." She left that night with her heart lighter than it had been in weeks, despite the humiliation of Margaret's public confrontation, buoyed by the certainty that whatever existed between herself and Alexander was no longer something either of them intended to deny. But humiliation, once witnessed by so many eyes, rarely stays contained to a single evening. By the following morning, word of the confrontation had spread throughout the extended family circle and beyond, embellished and distorted with each retelling. Some versions painted Clara as a scheming opportunist who had manipulated her way into Alexander's affections. Others suggested she had orchestrated the entire confrontation deliberately, seeking sympathy and attention through calculated vulnerability. Margaret, despite her public embarrassment, found ways to continue circulating unflattering rumors through more private channels, ensuring that whatever damage had been done to Clara's reputation would not easily heal. Clara's own family, upon hearing the exaggerated accounts, responded with a mixture of shock and renewed mockery, though this time laced with genuine concern about the consequences she might face for becoming entangled in circles so far beyond her own social standing. Her sister called that evening, worry evident beneath her usual teasing tone. "Clara, this isn't a joke anymore," Margaret Whitfield said, her voice serious in a way it rarely was. "People are saying terrible things about you. Are you certain you know what you're doing?" "I don't know anything for certain," Clara admitted quietly. "But I know how I feel, and I know Alexander has been honest with me about his own feelings. Whatever comes next, I have to see it through." Her sister's silence on the other end of the line carried its own quiet worry, though she did not argue further, perhaps sensing that Clara's mind was already made up regardless of what anyone else thought. Over the following days, Clara found herself increasingly isolated, caught between a family uncertain how to support her and a social circle within Ashworth Hall that viewed her with growing suspicion. Only Alexander's steady presence offered any comfort, his determination to defend her publicly whenever necessary providing a shield against the worst of the gossip, even as she began to wonder, quietly and painfully, whether she truly belonged in the world he inhabited. The doubt planted that week would grow steadily over the following days, taking root in a heart already exhausted from carrying the weight of everyone else's judgment. Clara returned to work the following Monday determined to focus on her responsibilities, hoping that immersion in familiar tasks might quiet the storm of speculation swirling around her. But even at her own office, the whispers had followed. A junior colleague named Charlotte approached her desk that morning with poorly disguised curiosity, asking pointed questions about the confrontation at the dinner, clearly hoping for details to share with others later. "I heard the Duke defended you quite dramatically," Charlotte said, perching on the edge of Clara's desk uninvited. "Is it true he called out Margaret Holloway in front of the entire family?" "I'd rather not discuss it," Clara said, keeping her eyes on her computer screen, though her hands had stilled over the keyboard. "Everyone's talking about it," Charlotte pressed. "Some people think it's romantic, others think you're playing a dangerous game. What do you think?" "I think I have work to finish," Clara said firmly, and after a moment of awkward silence, Charlotte finally retreated, though not without a knowing glance that suggested the conversation would continue elsewhere, without Clara's input or consent. Eleanor called her into the office again that afternoon, her expression grave. "Clara, I need to speak with you honestly. This situation with the Duke has become the subject of considerable talk, both within our office and beyond it. I have clients asking questions I don't know how to answer, and I'm concerned about how this might affect our firm's reputation." "I understand your concern," Clara said, though weariness had begun to creep into her voice. "But I haven't done anything unprofessional. Whatever is happening between the Duke and myself, it hasn't affected my work." "I believe you," Eleanor said, softening slightly. "But belief doesn't stop gossip, and it doesn't protect you from people who want to see you fail simply because your circumstances have changed. Be careful, Clara. I've seen situations like this before, and they rarely end well for the person with less power in the equation." The warning stayed with Clara throughout the remainder of the day, settling into the growing unease she had been trying to ignore. She thought of Alexander's steady reassurances, his willingness to defend her publicly, his evident sincerity when speaking of his feelings toward her. But she also thought of the countless ways their worlds diverged, the vast gulf between an event planner struggling to establish her own business and a Duke responsible for an entire estate, a family legacy, and the expectations of an entire social circle that had never welcomed outsiders easily. That evening, Alexander invited her to the estate again, this time for a quiet dinner away from the prying eyes of family gatherings or formal events. Clara arrived uncertain what to expect, her heart caught between hope and the growing weight of doubt that had settled over her since the confrontation with Margaret. They dined privately in a small sitting room adjacent to the main kitchen, away from the formal dining hall where so much of their earlier tension had unfolded. The atmosphere felt different here, quieter and more intimate, though Clara found herself unable to fully relax despite Alexander's evident efforts to put her at ease. "You've been distant since the dinner," Alexander observed, midway through the meal, setting down his fork to study her expression more closely. "I understand if the events of that evening have shaken you, but I hope you know my feelings haven't changed." "It's not that," Clara said, though the words felt inadequate to describe the tangled uncertainty churning within her. It's everything since then. The whispers at my office, the questions from my family, the way everyone seems to have an opinion about something that should be private between us. I wish I could shield you from all of it, Alexander said, genuine regret evident in his voice. But I cannot control what others say or think, no matter how much I wish otherwise. I know, Clara said quietly. And that's what worries me most. If this is difficult now, when we've barely acknowledged what exists between us, how much harder will it become if we continue forward? The scrutiny will only intensify, Alexander. I don't know if I'm strong enough to withstand a lifetime of it. Alexander reached across the table, his hand covering hers gently, his expression earnest and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him. I cannot promise the scrutiny will ever fully disappear. My world has always invited judgment, long before you entered it. But I can promise that whatever comes, you will not face it alone. I intend to stand beside you, publicly and without hesitation, for as long as you'll allow me to. His words offered comfort, though the doubt lingering in Clara's heart refused to fully quiet. She wanted to believe him entirely, wanted to trust that his devotion would prove strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. But some quieter, more cautious part of her mind kept returning to Margaret's cold insinuations, to Eleanor's warning about power imbalances, to her own family's initial mockery that had started this entire cascade of complications. She left the estate that night with her feelings more tangled than ever, torn between the genuine warmth of Alexander's affection and a growing fear that perhaps some distances were simply too vast to bridge safely, no matter how sincere the intentions of those attempting to cross them. Over the following days, the whispers continued unabated, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until Clara found herself the subject of speculation everywhere she turned, at work, among her family, even among strangers who somehow recognized her name from the increasingly public nature of the gossip surrounding Ashworth Hall. She began to withdraw, declining invitations from Alexander that she once would have eagerly accepted, telling herself she needed space to think clearly, though in truth, the mounting pressure had begun to feel unbearable. Alexander noticed her withdrawal immediately, his messages growing more concerned with each passing day, though Clara found herself unable to fully explain the fear taking root within her, a fear that went beyond simple social discomfort and touched something deeper, something that whispered she might be walking toward a heartbreak far greater than anything she had yet experienced. A letter arrived at Clara's apartment on a Tuesday morning, plain and unmarked, slipped beneath her door sometime during the night. She almost missed it entirely, nearly stepping on the envelope as she rushed to prepare for work, and when she finally opened it, her blood ran cold. The letter was from her father, a man she had not spoken to in nearly 3 years, ever since he had walked away from the family following a series of failed business ventures that had left them all struggling financially. She had assumed he had disappeared entirely from her life, content to leave the debts and broken promises behind him. But the letter made clear he had returned, and worse, that he had learned of her connection to Alexander Ashworth. The words on the page were carefully chosen, deliberately vague, but the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. Her father owed money to people who did not forgive debts easily. He had discovered her relationship with a wealthy duke and intended to use that connection, whether Clara consented or not, to resolve his obligations. The letter suggested, in language just ambiguous enough to avoid explicit confession, that he planned to approach Alexander directly, perhaps even threaten exposure of some fabricated scandal, unless Clara found a way to provide the funds herself first. Clara sat frozen at her kitchen table for nearly 20 minutes after reading it, the letter trembling in her hands, her mind racing through possibilities she could barely bring herself to consider. If her father approached Alexander directly, the resulting scandal would be catastrophic, not only for her own reputation but for the entire Ashworth family name. Whatever fragile trust she had built with Alexander, whatever genuine affection had grown between them, all of it would be tainted by association with a desperate man's financial schemes. Worse still, she understood her father well enough to know that once he set his mind toward exploiting a situation, subtlety would not remain his priority for long. If she refused to cooperate, or if Alexander's family responded with the kind of legal protection that wealthy families typically employed against such threats, her father would not hesitate to escalate matters, potentially fabricating scandal or manufacturing evidence that could destroy both her reputation and Alexander's public standing simultaneously. She spent that entire day at work in a fog, barely registering the tasks in front of her, her mind consumed with calculating impossible solutions to an impossible problem. She could not go to Alexander directly, not without risking exposing him to exactly the kind of scandal her father threatened to create. She could not ignore the letter, knowing her father's history of following through on threats when desperate enough. and she certainly could not afford whatever sum he demanded, not on an event planner's salary, not without draining every resource she possessed and likely still falling short. That evening, Alexander invited her to the estate again, unaware of the crisis unfolding in her mind. Clara arrived with her emotions carefully masked behind practiced composure, determined not to reveal the fear consuming her, until she had time to consider her options more carefully. They walked together through the gardens as the sun began to set, Alexander speaking warmly of plans for future events, of his hopes that perhaps, once enough time had passed and the gossip had quieted, they might consider something more formal between them, an acknowledgement to the family and eventually to society, of feelings neither of them intended to hide any longer. Clara listened, her heart aching with the knowledge of what she now carried, the impossible choice looming over every word of hope Alexander offered. How could she allow him to speak of a future together when her own father threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build, everything his family represented? "You're quiet tonight," Alexander observed as they paused beside the same peony garden where they had shared their earlier confession weeks before. "Is something troubling you?" Clara hesitated, torn between honesty and protection, before finally shaking her head. "Just tired. It's been a difficult week, with everything that's happened." Alexander studied her carefully, clearly sensing something deeper beneath her deflection, but he did not press the matter, perhaps assuming her exhaustion stemmed simply from the ongoing pressure of public scrutiny they had already discussed at length. "I want you to know," he said instead, turning to face her fully beneath the fading evening light, "that whatever difficulties we've faced these past weeks, I remain more certain than ever of my feelings toward you. I love you, Clara. I have for longer than I allowed myself to admit, and I no longer wish to keep that truth hidden, from you or from anyone else." The words she had longed to hear for years landed with unexpected weight, joy and devastation intertwining in a single moment that should have belonged entirely to happiness. Clara felt tears rise unbidden, and Alexander, misreading them as tears of joy, drew her gently into an embrace, his relief evident as he finally allowed himself to voice feelings long suppressed beneath careful restraint. "I love you too," Clara whispered, and the words were entirely true, even as her heart broke beneath the knowledge of what she now believed she had to do. They spent the remainder of the evening together, quiet and content, in a way that felt almost cruel given the storm gathering just beyond the estate's peaceful boundaries. Clara memorized every detail of that night, the warmth of his hand in hers, the low sound of his laughter, the quiet certainty in his voice whenever he spoke of their future together, storing each moment carefully as though she already sensed how soon she might lose access to them entirely. She left the estate that night with a decision beginning to crystallize in her mind, though she had not yet allowed herself to fully accept its implications. If her father's threats were as serious as the letter suggested, and if Alexander's genuine feelings meant he would refuse to simply pay off the debt and be done with it, insisting instead on confronting the matter directly and publicly defending her, the resulting scandal could unravel everything he had built. His family's reputation, his standing within the community, his ability to lead the charitable initiatives that mattered so deeply to him, all of it could be jeopardized by association with her father's desperate schemes. The only way to protect him, she realized with growing certainty, was to remove herself from the equation entirely, before her father could act, before Alexander could be drawn into a conflict that risked everything he valued. She did not sleep that night, spending the hours instead researching quietly, making careful arrangements, contacting a distant cousin who lived in a small coastal town several hours away, someone unlikely to be connected to either her family or Alexander's social circle. She packed only what she could carry easily, leaving behind furniture, most of her clothing, anything that might suggest a planned departure rather than a sudden disappearance. By morning, her decision had solidified into something unshakable. She would leave quietly, without explanation, allowing Alexander and everyone else to draw whatever conclusions they wished about her sudden absence. It would hurt him, she knew, perhaps more deeply than anything Margaret's cruel words or her family's mockery had inflicted. But better a temporary heartbreak, she reasoned, than the permanent devastation her father's scheme threatened to unleash upon everyone she had come to love. She left before dawn, her small car packed with the few belongings she had chosen to bring, driving away from the only home she had known for years without a single word of explanation to anyone. Not her sister, not Eleanor, not the man who had finally, after years of quiet longing, told her that he loved her. The letter she left behind, tucked into an envelope at her apartment where her sister would eventually find it, offered no true explanation, only vague assurances that she needed time away, that she was safe, and that she hoped everyone would understand eventually, though she doubted, even as she wrote the words, that understanding would come easily to anyone she left behind. By the time Alexander arrived at her apartment that afternoon, having grown concerned after she failed to respond to his messages throughout the morning, Clara was already 3 hours gone, her trail deliberately obscured, her heart shattered by a sacrifice she prayed would prove worth the cost. He knocked on her door repeatedly, calling her name, before finally convincing the building superintendent to let him inside, worry overriding any concern for propriety. The apartment greeted him with unsettling stillness, drawers left slightly open, closet space noticeably emptier than it should have been, and on the small kitchen table, an envelope addressed simply to her sister, sealed and waiting to be discovered. Alexander did not open the letter himself, though every instinct urged him to. Instead, he called Margaret Whitfield immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, explaining that Clara appeared to have left suddenly, and that he feared something was deeply wrong. Margaret arrived within the hour, her own face pale with worry as she read the letter her sister had left behind, searching for answers that Clara had deliberately withheld. "She says she needs time away," Margaret said, her voice trembling as she handed the letter to Alexander. "But this doesn't sound like Clara. She would never leave without telling someone where she was going, not like this." "Something happened," Alexander said, pacing the small living room, his mind racing through every conversation of the past weeks, searching for any clue he might have missed. Something serious enough to make her believe leaving was her only option. They spent the remainder of the afternoon searching for answers, questioning neighbors who had seen Clara leave before dawn, contacting her workplace where Eleanor confirmed she had not shown up and had not called to explain her absence, a complete departure from her usually reliable nature. No one seemed to know anything definitive, only that Clara had vanished as thoroughly and deliberately as someone determined never to be found. Alexander returned to the estate that evening consumed by a grief he had not expected to feel so acutely. The joy of the previous night's confession now transformed into a hollow ache of loss and confusion. He replayed their final conversation over and over, searching for any hint of what might have driven her to such a drastic decision. She had seemed distracted, yes, tired and quieter than usual, but nothing had suggested she was preparing to disappear entirely from his life without warning. He refused to accept the simplest explanation that others around him began to suggest, that Clara had perhaps never felt as deeply as she claimed, that she had grown overwhelmed by the pressures of their situation and simply fled rather than face the difficulties ahead. Something about that narrative felt fundamentally wrong to him, inconsistent with everything he had come to know about her character over the past weeks and months. Word of her disappearance spread quickly through the household staff, and eventually into the wider social circle that had already been watching their relationship with such intense scrutiny. The reactions varied predictably. Some expressed genuine concern for her well-being, worried that something dangerous might have befallen her. Others, less charitable, suggested that her departure confirmed every suspicion Margaret Holloway had raised weeks earlier, that Clara had perhaps achieved whatever she sought from the relationship and disappeared before consequences could catch up with her. Margaret Holloway herself seemed almost triumphant when the news reached her, her comments to other family members carrying an unmistakable satisfaction that Clara's sudden absence proved everything she had warned against from the beginning. "I told you she wasn't to be trusted," she remarked to a cousin during a family gathering held just days after Clara's disappearance. "Women like that always have their own agenda. She's likely moved on to her next opportunity already." Alexander, upon hearing these comments secondhand, felt fury rise within him unlike anything he had experienced in years. He knew Clara well enough to reject such cruel speculation entirely, though the absence of any explanation from her made it increasingly difficult to counter the narrative others were determined to construct in her absence. He hired a private investigator within the week, someone discreet and experienced in locating individuals who wished to remain hidden, instructing the man to search quietly and carefully, without drawing public attention to the effort. He told no one outside his most trusted staff about this decision, unwilling to give Margaret or others further material for their cruel speculation. Days passed without progress. Clara had covered her tracks with a thoroughness that suggested careful planning rather than impulsive flight, closing bank accounts, canceling her phone service, leaving no digital trail that could easily be followed. Alexander began to understand, with growing certainty, that whatever had driven her away, it was not a decision made lightly or without significant premeditation. He returned repeatedly to their final evening together, searching his memory for any detail that might offer a clue. She had seemed distracted near the end of their walk through the garden, her attention drifting even as he spoke of their future together. She had mentioned, briefly and without elaboration, that it had been a difficult week. He had assumed she meant the ongoing social scrutiny they both endured, but now he began to wonder if something more specific, more urgent, had been weighing on her mind that evening, something she had chosen not to share with him. The thought that she might have been protecting him from something, rather than simply fleeing the relationship itself, began to take root in his mind, though he could not yet imagine what threat might have seemed serious enough to warrant such an extreme and painful sacrifice. Whatever the truth, he refused to accept that their story had ended so abruptly, without explanation, without the chance to say goodbye properly. He intended to find her, wherever she had gone, and uncover the truth behind her sudden disappearance, no matter how long the search required. 3 weeks into the search, Alexander's private investigator, a careful and methodical man named Gregory, finally uncovered a thread worth pursuing. A withdrawal from an old savings account Clara had forgotten to close, made just days before her disappearance, traced back to a small branch in a coastal town nearly 4 hours from Ashworth Hall. The amount withdrawn was modest, barely enough to cover a month of basic living expenses, suggesting she had planned her departure with careful frugality rather than any intention of living comfortably wherever she landed. But more importantly, Gregory had also uncovered something else entirely, a piece of information that reframed everything Alexander had assumed about Clara's disappearance. "There's a man," Gregory explained, during a private meeting in Alexander's study, spreading several documents across the desk between them. Clara's father, a man named Edmund Whitfield, estranged from the family for several years. Records show he accumulated significant debts to some rather unsavory lenders before disappearing from his family's life. Recently, however, he resurfaced, and financial records suggest he had been actively investigating your family's finances in the weeks before Clara's disappearance. Alexander's stomach tightened as he absorbed the implications. "You're suggesting he threatened her somehow, used her connection to me as leverage." "I can't confirm his exact intentions," Gregory said carefully, "but the timing is difficult to ignore. A letter was delivered to Clara's apartment approximately 1 week before she vanished, according to a neighbor who recalled seeing an unfamiliar envelope pushed beneath her door. The same neighbor mentioned Clara appeared visibly distressed the following morning, though she offered no explanation at the time. Alexander sat back in his chair, pieces finally beginning to align into a coherent picture. Clara's distraction during their final evening together, her quiet admission that it had been a difficult week, her sudden and thoroughly planned disappearance immediately following whatever threat her father's letter had contained. She had not fled because her feelings had faltered. She had fled to protect him, believing herself capable of absorbing whatever consequences her father's scheme might unleash, so long as those consequences did not touch Alexander or his family's reputation. The realization brought both relief and fresh anguish. Relief, because it confirmed everything he had believed about her character, that her love had been genuine, that her disappearance had never been born from indifference or opportunism, as Margaret and others had so cruelly suggested. Anguish, because it meant Clara had spent the past 3 weeks alone, frightened, and burdened with a sacrifice she believed necessary, while he had remained ignorant of the true danger threatening her. "Find her," Alexander said, his voice hard with determination, "and find everything you can about Edmund Whitfield's current activities. If he intends to threaten my family, I want to understand exactly what we're facing before I confront either of them." Gregory nodded, gathering his documents. "I have a strong lead on her location already. Give me 2 more days, and I believe I can confirm her exact whereabouts." True to his word, Gregory returned within 48 hours with confirmation. Clara had taken a modest position as a shop assistant in a small coastal town, working under a slightly altered version of her name, living in a rented room above a bakery owned by an elderly widow who had asked few questions about her new tenant's circumstances. Alexander made the journey himself the following morning, refusing to send anyone in his place, needing to see her, to speak with her directly, to understand fully what had driven her to such lengths, and to offer whatever protection and support she needed to finally set aside the burden she had chosen to carry alone. The coastal town was quiet and unassuming, narrow streets lined with small shops catering to local residents and the occasional tourist drawn by the nearby beaches. Alexander found the bakery without difficulty, its modest storefront tucked between a fishmonger and a small clothing shop, and he stood outside for a long moment, gathering his composure before stepping inside. Clara was behind the counter when he entered, her hair pulled back simply, wearing an apron dusted with flour, so different from the composed professional he had known at Ashworth Hall that for a moment, he almost doubted Gregory's identification. But then she looked up and recognition flooded her features immediately, followed swiftly by shock, then fear, then something that looked painfully like relief mixed with dread. "Alexander," she breathed, her hand stilling over the register. "How did you find me?" "I hired someone to search," he admitted. "I couldn't accept that you had simply left without reason, Clara, not after everything we shared." She glanced nervously toward the back room, where the elderly shop owner presumably remained unaware of the conversation unfolding at the counter. "You shouldn't be here. It isn't safe for either of us." "I know about your father," Alexander said quietly, watching her expression crumble slightly at the revelation. "I know about the letter, about the debts he owes, about whatever threats he made against you, or against my family. Clara, you didn't have to face this alone. You didn't have to disappear to protect me." Tears finally broke free from the composure she had maintained since his arrival, and she stepped around the counter, glancing once more toward the back room, before gesturing him toward the shop's small side entrance, away from potential customers who might witness the conversation. Outside, in the narrow alley beside the bakery, Clara finally allowed herself to speak freely, the words tumbling out in a rush of relief and lingering fear. "My father found me weeks ago, threatening to approach you directly, to fabricate some scandal or manufacture evidence of wrongdoing, unless I paid him an amount I could never hope to raise. I knew if he followed through, the resulting exposure would damage everything you've built, everything your family represents. I couldn't let that happen, Alexander. I couldn't let my own family's failures destroy your reputation." "You should have told me," Alexander said, gently but firmly, taking her hands in his own. "I could have protected you, protected both of us, without you having to disappear and face this alone." "I was afraid," Clara admitted. "Afraid that if I told you, you would insist on confronting him directly, and that confrontation itself would create the very scandal I was trying to prevent. I thought if I simply disappeared, removed myself from your life entirely, he would have no leverage left to use against either of us. And instead you spent 3 weeks alone, frightened, hiding under a false name, while I searched desperately trying to understand what had happened to you," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, that is not protection. That is unnecessary suffering, for both of us." She lowered her eyes, guilt evident in her expression. "I didn't know what else to do." "We face this together," Alexander said firmly, lifting her chin gently so she met his gaze directly. "Whatever your father intends, whatever scheme he's constructed, we confront it together, publicly if necessary, with the full resources and protection my family can provide. I refuse to let you carry this burden alone any longer." "He'll destroy your reputation," Clara warned. "Whatever fabricated scandal he's prepared, once it becomes public, the damage will be done regardless of whether the accusations are true." "Let him try," Alexander said, a fierce determination replacing his earlier gentleness. "My family's legal team is more than capable of exposing extortion and fabricated claims for exactly what they are. And frankly, Clara, I would rather weather whatever temporary scandal your father manufactures than spend another day without you beside me, hiding under a false name in a town 4 hours from everything and everyone who cares about you." Clara searched his eyes for any hint of hesitation, finding none, only the same unwavering certainty he had shown her weeks earlier in the peony garden, before all of this had begun. Slowly, cautiously, hope began to replace the fear that had governed her every decision since her father's letter first arrived. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Alexander said, "you come home, and we deal with your father together, on our own terms, rather than allowing him to dictate the narrative through fear and threats." They spent the remainder of that afternoon discussing logistics, Alexander insisting on personally handling her departure from the bakery and her temporary living arrangements, ensuring the elderly shop owner received fair compensation for the sudden loss of her assistant and understood nothing of the true circumstances behind Clara's abrupt departure. By evening, they were driving back toward Ashworth Hall together, Clara seated beside Alexander with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety about what awaited them upon return. The confrontation with her father still loomed ahead, unresolved and potentially damaging regardless of Alexander's confident assurances. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she did not face that uncertain future alone. And something about Alexander's steady presence beside her made even the most daunting challenges feel, for the first time, genuinely surmountable. As they approached the outskirts of the estate grounds, Alexander's phone rang with an urgent call from his legal advisor. Edmund Whitfield, it seemed, had grown impatient during Clara's absence and had already begun making contact with certain members of the press, hinting at scandal and impropriety within the Ashworth family that he claimed to possess evidence for. The confrontation Alexander had hoped to control on his own terms was accelerating faster than anticipated, and both of them understood, in that moment, that whatever battle lay ahead would need to be fought immediately, without further delay. "How much time do we have?" Clara asked, her earlier relief giving way to renewed anxiety as she watched Alexander's expression darken while he listened to the details his advisor relayed over the phone. "Not much," Alexander said, ending the call and turning to face her fully. He's approached a journalist at a regional paper, claiming he has evidence of financial impropriety connected to the estate's charitable foundation. It's fabricated, of course, but fabricated claims can still cause damage if they reach print before we have a chance to respond properly. What can we do? Get ahead of it, Alexander said, already redirecting the car toward the estate rather than her apartment. We tell the truth before he has the chance to twist it into something ugly. I want you with me when we speak to my legal team tonight. This concerns you as much as it concerns my family, and I won't have decisions made about your situation without your voice in the room. They arrived at Ashworth Hall just after nightfall, and Alexander immediately gathered his most trusted advisors, a small team consisting of his legal counsel, a woman named Charlotte Bentley who had served the family for over a decade, and his head of communications, a quietly efficient man named Nathaniel Cross. Clara sat beside Alexander throughout the meeting, her nerves gradually settling as she watched him take control of the situation with calm, methodical determination. Edmund Whitfield has no legitimate evidence, Charlotte explained, after reviewing the details Alexander provided. Financial impropriety claims require documentation, and unless he's fabricated something remarkably convincing, this will collapse the moment any credible journalist requests verification. However, the damage of an initial headline can linger even after retraction, so our priority should be preventing publication entirely, if possible. Can we do that? Alexander asked. We can offer the journalist an exclusive interview, one that gets ahead of the narrative entirely, Nathaniel suggested. Rather than letting Whitfield control the story, we present the truth ourselves, transparently. A man in debt, attempting to extort a family through his estranged daughter, using fabricated claims because he had no other leverage. It's not glamorous, but it removes his power entirely, and it protects Miss Whitfield's reputation far more effectively than silence would. Clara felt her chest tighten at the suggestion. That would mean speaking publicly about my father, about everything he's done. My family would be exposed in front of the entire community. It would, Alexander said gently, turning to face her directly. But it would also be the truth, and the truth, once spoken plainly, leaves no room for further manipulation or rumor. You would no longer be the subject of speculation, Clara. You would be understood, finally, as someone who sacrificed her own comfort and reputation to protect people she loved, rather than someone with hidden motives. Clara considered the proposal carefully, weighing the discomfort of public exposure against the alternative of continuing to hide, continuing to let others construct false narratives about her character and motives. Finally, she nodded, drawing strength from Alexander's steady presence beside her. I'll do it, she said. If it means the truth finally replaces the rumors, I'm willing to face whatever comes next. The following morning, Alexander's team arranged an interview with a respected regional journalist, someone known for balanced reporting rather than sensationalism. Clara sat beside Alexander throughout the interview, her voice steady despite the nervousness she felt, explaining honestly the circumstances that had led to her sudden disappearance weeks earlier. Her father's threats, her decision to protect Alexander and his family by removing herself from the situation entirely, and her eventual return once Alexander discovered the truth and insisted on facing the matter together rather than allowing her to bear the burden alone. The journalist listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, and by the time the interview concluded, it was clear that whatever story emerged would paint Clara not as a calculating opportunist, as Margaret and others had suggested, but as someone who had endured genuine hardship and responded with quiet sacrifice rather than selfish ambition. The article published 2 days later, and its impact proved immediate and significant. Public sentiment, which had been divided and increasingly critical during Clara's mysterious absence, shifted decisively in her favor once the true circumstances became known. Edmund Whitfield's attempted extortion, once exposed publicly and definitively, left him with no remaining leverage, and threats of further legal action from Alexander's team ensured he would not attempt similar schemes in the future. Margaret Holloway, who had been among the most vocal critics during Clara's disappearance, found herself notably quiet following the article's publication, her earlier insinuations now standing in stark and uncomfortable contrast to the sympathetic truth the public had come to understand. Clara's own family, upon reading the full account of what she had endured to protect Alexander, responded with a mixture of guilt and renewed support. Her sister called that same evening, tears evident in her voice as she apologized for the mockery that had started this entire chain of events weeks earlier. I had no idea what you were dealing with, Margaret Whitfield said. I'm sorry, Clara, for everything I said, for not taking your feelings seriously from the start. You deserved better from your own family. Thank you, Clara said quietly, relief washing over her at finally receiving the understanding she had craved for so long. It means more than you know, hearing that now. As the immediate crisis began to settle, Alexander turned his attention toward Clara herself, toward rebuilding the trust and connection that her father's threats had so violently disrupted. He understood that reputation, while important, mattered far less than ensuring Clara herself felt safe, protected, and genuinely valued, not merely as a subject of public sympathy, but as someone deserving of lasting happiness after enduring so much unnecessary suffering. "This isn't over yet," he told her, one evening as they sat together in the same garden where their story had truly begun weeks earlier. "The public understands the truth now, but there's still the matter of ensuring you never have to fear something like this happening again. And there's still the matter of what I intend to ask you, once the timing feels right." Clara looked up at him, curiosity and cautious hope mingling in her expression. "What do you intend to ask?" Alexander smiled, though he offered no further explanation that evening, only a promise that the answer would come soon enough, once the last remaining shadows of scandal and doubt had been fully cleared away. 3 weeks passed following the publication of Clara's story, weeks during which the last traces of scandal surrounding her name faded steadily into memory, replaced by a quiet but growing public admiration for a woman who had sacrificed her own comfort to protect someone she loved. Edmund Whitfield, faced with the collapse of his extortion scheme and the threat of legal consequences, disappeared once again from Clara's life, this time with no indication he intended to return. Alexander used the time to address matters closer to home as well. He called a formal family meeting, something rarely convened outside of significant estate business, and used the occasion to speak plainly about his intentions regarding Clara, making clear to every relative present that any further disrespect toward her would not be tolerated within his household or his social circle. Margaret Holloway, present at that meeting despite her evident discomfort, listened in uncharacteristic silence as Alexander addressed the room directly. "Clara Whitfield has shown more courage and integrity throughout this entire situation than most of us gathered here today," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled family members. "She sacrificed her own reputation, her own comfort, and very nearly her own safety, all to protect this family from a threat none of us even knew existed. I expect every one of you to treat her with the respect that courage deserves, going forward." The room remained quiet following his statement, several family members exchanging uncomfortable glances, aware that Alexander's words carried the weight of expectation rather than mere suggestion. Margaret, in particular, seemed to shrink slightly under the collective attention, now turned briefly toward her, given her prominent role in the earlier campaign of gossip and insinuation against Clara. After the meeting concluded, Alexander turned his attention toward planning something he had been considering carefully since Clara's return from the coastal town. A gesture significant enough to demonstrate publicly and unmistakably the depth of his commitment, not only to Clara herself but to ensuring the entire community understood, beyond any doubt, the truth of his feelings. He began by speaking privately with Clara's sister, seeking her blessing and gathering small details about Clara's preferences that might help him plan something meaningful rather than merely grand. Margaret Whitfield, eager to make amends for her earlier mockery, offered enthusiastic assistance, sharing stories from their childhood, small preferences Clara had mentioned over the years, details that would help Alexander craft a gesture that felt personal rather than performative. The occasion Alexander selected was a charity gala scheduled for the following month, the same event category that had first brought Clara into his life years earlier when she coordinated the Children's Hospital fundraiser, where he had first noticed her quiet kindness. He requested that Clara oversee the event's planning once again, this time explicitly as the event's official planner rather than through the careful secrecy that had characterized their earlier collaborations. Clara agreed readily, unaware of the deeper significance Alexander had attached to this particular gathering, throwing herself into preparations with her usual meticulous attention to detail, coordinating flowers, catering, seating arrangements, and entertainment for what she understood simply to be another important charitable event. The evening of the gala arrived with clear skies and a gentle warmth that seemed to promise good fortune for whatever the night might bring. Ashworth Hall's main hall had been transformed beautifully, exactly as Clara had envisioned, elegant without being ostentatious, warm and welcoming rather than intimidatingly formal. Guests began arriving in the early evening, filling the space with conversation and laughter, the atmosphere considerably lighter than the tense confrontations that had marked previous gatherings. Clara moved through the crowd checking details, ensuring everything proceeded according to plan, when Alexander found her near the entrance to the main dining hall, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had rarely witnessed from him before. "Everything looks wonderful," he said, taking her hand gently. You've outdone yourself once again. I'm glad you're pleased, Clara said, smiling despite the exhaustion of weeks spent coordinating every detail. The hospital foundation should be thrilled with tonight's turnout. There's something I need to discuss with you, Alexander said, his voice carrying an unusual seriousness despite the festive atmosphere surrounding them. Would you walk with me for a moment, away from the crowd? Curious but unsuspecting, Clara allowed him to guide her toward the same garden where so much of their story had unfolded, the peonies now in full bloom beneath strings of soft lights that staff had carefully arranged earlier that evening. She had not noticed the additional preparation during her earlier rounds, too focused on managing the details of the main event to pay attention to this quieter corner of the estate. Alexander, what's happening? She asked, sensing something significant building in the air around them as they walked deeper into the illuminated garden. He stopped beneath an archway covered in climbing roses, turning to face her fully, his expression a mixture of nervousness and unmistakable joy. Clara, from the moment I first watched you kneel beside a frightened child at that hospital fundraiser years ago, I recognized something in you that I had rarely encountered in the world I inhabit. Genuine kindness offered without expectation of recognition or reward. I did not understand then how deeply that quality would come to mean to me, nor did I anticipate the journey that would eventually bring us to this moment. Clara felt her breath catch, understanding beginning to dawn as Alexander reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that caught the soft garden lighting. You have shown more courage in the face of judgment, cruelty, and genuine danger than anyone I have ever known, he continued, lowering himself onto one knee before her, the box now open to reveal a ring of simple but exquisite design, nothing ostentatious. Exactly the kind of understated elegance Clara herself favored. You sacrificed everything to protect me and my family, without hesitation, without expecting recognition or reward for that sacrifice. I love you, Clara Whitfield, entirely and without reservation, and I want nothing more than to spend the remainder of my life ensuring you never again have to face judgment or hardship alone. Will you marry me? Tears streamed freely down Clara's face as she absorbed the weight of his words, memories flooding back of her family's mockery, of Margaret's cruel insinuations, of the desperate flight she had undertaken to protect this very man now kneeling before her with such raw and unguarded devotion. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. He rose immediately, sliding the ring onto her trembling finger before drawing her into an embrace that erased, at least for that single perfect moment, every remaining doubt or fear that had haunted their relationship from its earliest beginnings. What neither of them realized was that several guests had followed at a discreet distance, curious about Alexander's sudden disappearance from the main event, and had witnessed the proposal from just beyond the garden's entrance. Word spread quickly through the gathering, and by the time Alexander and Clara returned to the main hall, hands intertwined and Clara's new ring clearly visible, the entire room had already learned what had transpired in the garden. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Guests who had once whispered doubts about Clara's intentions now offered genuine congratulations, understanding fully the truth of a relationship that had weathered extraordinary hardship to arrive at this joyful conclusion. Even Margaret Holloway, present among the crowd, offered a stiff but sincere congratulation, perhaps recognizing that continued hostility would only isolate her further from a family now firmly united in support of Clara's new position within their circle. Clara's own family arrived within the hour, having been contacted immediately by her sister once news of the engagement reached her. Margaret Whitfield embraced Clara tightly, tears of genuine joy replacing the earlier guilt that had colored their relationship since the scandal first erupted weeks before. I'm so happy for you, Margaret said, and so sorry again for everything I said that started this. You deserve every bit of this happiness, Clara. You always did. The evening continued long into the night, celebration replacing the tension and judgment that had defined so much of Clara's journey toward this moment. As the gathering finally began to wind down, Alexander found a quiet moment to speak privately with Clara once more, this time without the weight of nervousness that had characterized his earlier proposal. Everyone who once laughed at your feelings for me, he said softly, witnessed tonight exactly how wrong they were. Your love was never foolish, Clara. It was simply ahead of what everyone else was ready to understand. Clara smiled, leaning into his embrace as the last guests began departing into the night. I never imagined this is where we would end up, when I first admitted my feelings to a room full of laughter and doubt. Neither did I, Alexander admitted, but I'm profoundly grateful the story led us here, despite every obstacle along the way. Together, they watched the final guests depart, the estate slowly quieting around them, the promise of a future finally secure, after weeks of uncertainty, judgment, and genuine danger. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer burdened by secrecy or fear, but bound instead by a love that had proven itself capable of withstanding far more than either of them had ever anticipated when their story first began. In the weeks that followed the engagement, Clara found herself navigating an entirely new rhythm of life, one where the whispers that had once followed her every step through Ashworth Hall had transformed into warm greetings and genuine curiosity about wedding plans. Eleanor, her former manager, called personally to offer congratulations, admitting with a laugh that she had never expected the office gossip to end quite so happily. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said during that call. "I worried this situation would harm your career, and instead it seems to have opened doors I never anticipated. Several clients have already asked whether you might consider starting your own firm, now that your name carries such recognition." The suggestion lingered with Clara long after the call ended. She had mentioned the dream of her own event planning company to Alexander months earlier, during one of their early private conversations, never expecting the idea to become anything more than a distant aspiration. But with Eleanor's words echoing in her mind, and with Alexander's earlier encouragement resurfacing in memory, Clara began to seriously consider whether the time had finally come to pursue that ambition in earnest. She raised the subject with Alexander one evening, uncertain how he might respond to the idea of his future wife maintaining an independent career, rather than settling comfortably into the traditional expectations often placed upon those who married into families like his. "I think it's a wonderful idea," Alexander said without hesitation, his enthusiasm immediate and genuine. "You have every talent required to succeed, and I would never want you to feel confined by outdated expectations about what a duchess should or should not pursue. If event planning brings you fulfillment, then you should absolutely build that company, and I intend to support you fully in whatever way you need." His unwavering support meant more to Clara than she could easily express, another reminder of why she had fallen in love with him so completely, despite every obstacle that had once seemed insurmountable. Within weeks, she had begun the early stages of establishing her own firm, drawing on connections built through years of work at Ashworth Hall and the broader recognition that had come from the public attention surrounding their engagement. Margaret Holloway, meanwhile, found her own position within the family circle subtly but noticeably diminished. Though she remained technically welcome at family gatherings, given her blood relation to the Ashworth line, her earlier campaign of cruelty toward Clara had cost her considerable standing among relatives who had come to respect Clara's courage and character. She attended the following family Christmas gathering with markedly less confidence than she had once displayed, offering Clara polite but distant courtesy rather than her previous condescension. Clara, for her part, harbored no desire for revenge or continued conflict. She greeted Margaret with the same measured kindness she extended to everyone, understanding that the woman's cruelty had likely stemmed from insecurities of her own, threatened perhaps by the genuine devotion Alexander showed toward someone outside their usual social circle. Whatever Margaret's motivations, Clara found herself unwilling to carry forward bitterness that no longer served any purpose in the happiness she had finally found. The wedding itself was planned for the following spring, timed deliberately to coincide with the full blooming of the peonies that held such significant meaning for both of them. Clara insisted on handling much of the planning herself, applying her professional expertise to ensure every detail reflected both her own preferences and the traditions important to Alexander's family, blending both worlds into a celebration that honored where they had each come from while looking forward to the future they intended to build together. Her own family attended the planning process with enthusiastic involvement, her sister Margaret Whitfield serving as an eager assistant throughout the preparations, their earlier tension entirely dissolved into genuine closeness restored by everything they had weathered together over recent months. As winter gave way to the earliest signs of spring, and the wedding date drew steadily closer, Clara found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought of that humiliating night on the terrace, of her family's laughter, of the terror she had felt reading her father's threatening letter, of the frightened weeks spent hiding under a false name in a coastal town far from everyone she loved. Each difficult chapter had tested her in ways she never could have anticipated, yet each had also revealed strength within herself she had not previously recognized, and had ultimately led her toward a happiness more profound than she had ever dared imagine possible. Alexander, too, reflected often on their journey together, recognizing how close they had come to losing everything before finally arriving at this moment of security and joy. He resolved, in quiet private moments, to never again allow fear of judgment or scandal to prevent him from protecting and honoring the woman he loved, regardless of what obstacles the world might present in the future. On the morning of their wedding, held in the very garden where Alexander had proposed months earlier, surrounded by blooming peonies and the assembled company of both their families, now united rather than divided by the trials they had endured together. Clara stood ready to walk toward a future she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Her sister adjusted the final details of her dress, tears of joy rather than earlier mockery shining in her eyes. "Who would have thought," Margaret Whitfield whispered, "that the joke we made that night would become the greatest love story any of us have ever witnessed?" Clara smiled, taking her sister's hand gently. Sometimes the things people find hardest to believe turn out to be the truest of all. As she walked down the aisle moments later, meeting Alexander's gaze across the flower-filled garden, every whisper of doubt, every cruel word once spoken against her, faded entirely into insignificance beside the simple and undeniable truth standing before her. She had been mocked for loving a duke who seemed impossibly far beyond her reach. Instead, that love had proven strong enough to weather betrayal, danger, and public scrutiny, emerging not weakened but transformed into something the entire community now recognized as genuine, resilient, and thoroughly deserving of celebration. 1 year into their marriage, Clara stood inside the newly finished office space of her own event planning company, a converted stable building on the edge of the Ashworth estate that Alexander had insisted on renovating for her use once her client list outgrew the small rented room she had started with. The walls were lined with photographs from events she had coordinated over the past 12 months. Weddings, charity galas, corporate gatherings, each one a testament to the reputation she had built entirely on her own merit, separate from her marriage into the Ashworth family. Her business had grown faster than she anticipated, clients drawn not only by curiosity about the now famous Duchess but increasingly by genuine recognition of her talent and dedication. She had recently hired her first 2 employees, young women eager to learn the trade under her guidance, and she found unexpected fulfillment in mentoring them, remembering her own early years of uncertainty before she had found her footing in the profession. Alexander appeared in the doorway that afternoon, still dressed in the riding clothes he had worn for his morning survey of the estate grounds, a habit he maintained from childhood despite the many responsibilities that now filled his days. "The new sign looks wonderful," he said, gesturing toward the freshly painted lettering above the entrance that read simply, "Whitfield Events." "I almost changed it to Ashworth," Clara admitted, setting down the folder she had been reviewing. "But something felt important about keeping my own name on this. It's the name I built this company under, before any of this began." "I'm glad you kept it," Alexander said, crossing the room to join her at the desk. "You built something entirely your own, Clara. That deserves recognition separate from anything connected to my family name." Their relationship had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the past year, one that balanced the formal obligations of Alexander's position with the independence Clara had fought so hard to establish for herself. She continued running her business while also gradually taking on certain responsibilities within the estate's charitable initiatives, drawn particularly toward expanding the Children's Hospital partnership that had first brought her into Alexander's orbit years earlier. Their wedding had marked not an ending but a beginning, and the challenges of building a life together across such different worlds had not disappeared entirely, simply because their love had triumphed over earlier obstacles. Clara still occasionally felt the weight of expectation that came with her new title, the scrutiny that followed public figures regardless of how settled their personal happiness became. But she had learned, over the months since their wedding, to navigate that scrutiny with far greater confidence than the frightened woman who had once fled to a coastal town to escape judgment entirely. Margaret Holloway had, surprisingly, become something of an ally in recent months, her earlier hostility softening considerably after she found herself facing her own family difficulties, that Clara, remembering her own painful experience with judgment and gossip, chose to meet with compassion rather than the coldness Margaret might have once expected. The 2 women would never be close friends, but a wary mutual respect had developed between them, born from Clara's decision to extend grace rather than harbor lingering resentment. Clara's father remained entirely absent from her life, having relocated to another region following the collapse of his extortion scheme, and though Clara occasionally wondered about his circumstances, she had made peace with the necessity of that distance, understanding that some relationships, once broken by betrayal, could not be easily or safely repaired. Her relationship with her sister, however, had deepened considerably since the difficult months surrounding her disappearance and eventual engagement. Margaret Whitfield visited regularly, often bringing her own young daughter along, a bright and curious child who had taken to calling Clara her favorite aunt, despite considerable competition from other family members eager for the title. One afternoon in early autumn, nearly 14 months after their wedding, Clara found herself experiencing an unexpected wave of nausea while reviewing seating charts for an upcoming charity dinner. She dismissed it initially as simple fatigue from the demanding schedule she had maintained throughout the busy autumn event season, but when the sensation persisted over several days, accompanied by an unusual exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to remedy, she finally visited the estate's physician for a routine examination. The news that followed changed the trajectory of their lives once again, though this time toward joy rather than crisis. Clara was expecting their first child, a discovery that filled both her and Alexander with a happiness neither had fully anticipated amid the busy demands of their respective responsibilities. Alexander's reaction, when Clara shared the news that evening in the same garden where he had once proposed, was one of pure and uncomplicated joy, tears gathering in his eyes as he embraced her carefully, already speaking of nurseries and names and the future they would build together as parents. "I never imagined this particular chapter of our story," Clara admitted, laughing softly through her own happy tears. "After everything we've faced, somehow this feels like the truest miracle of all." "Every chapter of our story has surprised me," Alexander replied, "but none more wonderfully than this one." The pregnancy proceeded smoothly over the following months, Clara continuing her work at Whitfield Events for as long as her energy allowed, gradually delegating more responsibility to her trusted employees as her due date approached. The household staff at Ashworth Hall, who had witnessed the entire arc of Clara and Alexander's relationship from its uncertain beginnings through scandal and eventual triumph, greeted news of the pregnancy with genuine warmth, many of them having grown fond of Clara's kindness and dedication over the years she had worked among them. Their daughter arrived on a bright morning in early spring, nearly 2 years after that first humiliating conversation on Clara's family terrace had set their entire story into motion. They named her Eleanor, in honor of the manager who had shown Clara such unexpected loyalty and support during the most difficult period of her professional life, a small gesture of gratitude for kindness that had meant more than Clara ever fully expressed at the time. Holding their daughter for the first time, Clara found herself thinking again of that painful night on the terrace, of her family's cruel laughter, of every doubt and fear that had once convinced her she would never belong in the world Alexander inhabited. Looking now at the small, sleeping child in her arms, and at Alexander beside her, his expression radiant with a joy she had never before witnessed from him, she understood fully how far they had traveled from that uncertain beginning. The mockery that had once wounded her so deeply had long since faded into irrelevance, replaced by a life built on genuine love, mutual respect, and the hard-won understanding that true partnership required both courage and honesty, qualities she and Alexander had each demonstrated repeatedly throughout their journey together. As word of their daughter's birth spread through the extended family and wider community, congratulations poured in from every direction, including, somewhat to Clara's surprise, a brief but genuinely warm message from Margaret Holloway, offering sincere best wishes for the new family. Clara read the message with quiet satisfaction, recognizing it as further confirmation of how thoroughly their story had transformed not only their own lives but the attitudes of those who had once doubted them so cruelly. That evening, as the household finally settled into quiet following a day of celebration and visitors, Alexander sat beside Clara's bed, watching her hold their sleeping daughter with an expression of contentment that mirrored his own. "They laughed at you once," he said softly, "for loving someone they believed was impossibly beyond your reach. I wonder what they would say now, seeing where that love has led us." Clara smiled, looking down at their daughter, before meeting Alexander's eyes once more. "I think," she said quietly, "they would finally understand that love was never about reaching beyond your station. It was simply about recognizing something true, and having the courage to hold on to it, no matter what anyone else believed." Outside their window, the peonies Alexander's mother had once tended continued blooming faithfully each spring, a quiet and constant reminder of the garden where their story had truly begun, and of the enduring love that had ultimately proven every doubt, every cruel word, and every moment of fear entirely and beautifully wrong. In the months that followed their daughter's birth, Clara gradually returned to her work at Whitfield Events, though at a slower and more deliberate pace than before. Determined to balance her professional ambitions with the joys of early motherhood, Alexander adjusted his own schedule considerably, delegating certain estate responsibilities to trusted staff so that he could spend more time at home, unwilling to miss the small daily milestones of his daughter's early life, the way his own father, consumed by duty, had once missed much of his childhood. Eleanor, the young manager who had once worried so genuinely about Clara's well-being during the darkest days of the scandal, visited often during those early months, delighting in her namesake and offering the same steady support she had shown years earlier, before either of them could have imagined how completely Clara's life would transform. The estate itself seemed to soften under the influence of the growing family within its walls. Staff members who remembered the tense whispers and cautious gossip of earlier years now spoke warmly of watching young Eleanor take her first unsteady steps across the same gardens where her parents had once faced such uncertainty. The peony garden, in particular, became a favorite gathering place for the family, Clara often bringing her daughter there in the late afternoons to watch the light shift golden across the blooms as Alexander finished his daily responsibilities. Margaret Whitfield's daughter and young Eleanor grew close as cousins over the following years, their friendship a quiet testament to how thoroughly the fractures within Clara's own family had healed since those early days of mockery and doubt. Family gatherings, once fraught with tension and unspoken judgment, became instead occasions of genuine warmth, the painful history that had once defined their relationships, gradually replaced by newer, gentler memories. Years later, when Eleanor grew old enough to ask about the story of how her parents had fallen in love, Clara would tell her, gently and honestly, about the mockery she had once faced, about the frightened weeks spent hiding beneath a false name, about the courage it had taken for both her and Alexander to choose truth and love over fear and public opinion. She wanted her daughter to understand, from an early age, that genuine love sometimes required sacrifice and resilience, but that it was always, in the end, worth the difficulty required to protect it. "Did you know he loved you back, even when everyone was laughing?" young Eleanor once asked, curled beside her mother in the very garden where so much of the story had unfolded. "I hoped," Clara admitted, smiling at the memory of her own uncertainty all those years before. "But hope alone rarely feels like enough, when the whole world seems certain you're wrong. It took courage, on both our parts, to discover that hope had been telling the truth all along." Alexander, listening from nearby, caught his wife's eye and smiled, the same warmth passing between them that had first drawn them together years earlier, now deepened and strengthened by everything they had built together since. Whatever challenges still awaited their family in the years ahead, they faced them now with the quiet confidence of two people who had already proven, beyond any doubt, that their love could withstand far more than anyone had ever believed possible.